Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for joining this webinar. Can you tell the difference between science and propaganda? Hopefully, after this webinar, you will be able to. This webinar is hosted by United Central Coast for Action, a program of the Slow Climate Coalition. I'm John Smigelski. I lead the Central Coast Action program. We're excited to bring this program. Can you tell the difference between science and propaganda? We are recording this webinar, and a copy will be sent to all registrants. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentations. So during the presentations, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature, and we will answer them at that time. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Susan Callery, who will be introducing the speakers. Susan is the lead for the Solar Climate Coalition for offshore wind. A retired NASA communication leader, she served as managing editor of NASA's Global Climate Change website and Earth Science Communication Manager at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where she helped communicate Earth science to millions of people worldwide. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. I'm very excited about this webinar, and I'm excited to be here. When I worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, people often assumed that the hardest part of my job was understanding the science. And it really wasn't. The hardest part was helping people figure out what was actually science and what only looked like science. And I ended up spending a lot of time reading websites and they had polished graphs, technical language, and lists of scientific references. And at first they looked very convincing, but I'm a researcher at heart. And when I dug a little bit deeper, I found that the graphs had been cherry picked, the studies were being misrepresented, and the so-called experts weren't experts in their field at all, in the field of climate in particular. And that's when I really realized something important and why we're having this webinar today. Propaganda never announces itself. It doesn't come with a warning label that says, I'm propaganda. More often, it disguises itself as science. By the end of this webinar, my goal is that you'll have the tools to spot the difference. And you'll never look at a viral post, a YouTube video, or even a news story quite the same way again. So we are so honored to have our two guest speakers today. They are true experts in what I call disinformation rather than misinformation. I say that because a lot of this isn't unintentional. Science denial has become a big business, and it's spanned from tobacco to climate to vaccines and, frankly, renewable energy. So now I want to introduce our first speaker. He was a colleague of mine at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He's a historian of science and technology and a writer. He was our historian at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he's now a professor at Purdue University. He co-authored the book Merchants of Doubt with Naomi Oreskes, which also became a movie. He also wrote The Collapse of Western Civilization, The Bug Myth. He's written about Mars exploration, asteroid science, and supersonic aircraft. He's currently completing an update to 2014's Collapse of Western Civilization. So with that, I am so pleased to have with us Dr. Erik Conway.
Thanks, Susan.
Erik.
Hopefully I've set this up properly and my screen will share like it's supposed to. And there we go. Okay, Susan asked me to talk about, to give a brief history of environmental denial, really. And I'm going to talk about market fundamentalism and the Potemkin village of science that spreads so much false information. So Americans are awash in a sea of science denial, and it takes enormous numbers of forms and covers enormous numbers of subjects too. So there's denial of evolution, there's denial of climate change. I don't believe in global warming. There's rejection of masking and vaccination. And Naomi Oreskes and I now, oh, good grief, starting in about 2004, decided to start investigating historically how this all came about. And one thing we've learned about it is that science denial is not primarily a problem of education or of ignorance. Many people who reject evolution or climate change are well educated. Their denial is what we call active. They have to actively resist understanding of subjects that are important to them. And so this is the story that Naomi and I told in Merchants of Doubt. Our subjects were 4 PhD level physicists, all of whom had been important science managers in the United States, who spent their retirements casting doubt not just on climate science, but a whole set of scientific issues: the harms of tobacco, the reality of acid rain, threat of stratospheric ozone depletion in the ozone hole. So the question we wanted to answer is, why would these educated, intelligent, highly placed people deny basic scientific findings, especially about stuff that it was as well established as the harms of tobacco or as consequential as the ozone hole? And this is what we wrote about in Merchants of Doubt. And our answer to that question had nothing to do with science. It was about politics. Science denial really had nothing to do with science. It was not based on problems with the science, like inadequate data or uncertain models or insufficiently large sample sizes. Nothing about the techno trivia really of modern science. It was rooted in the ideology of market fundamentalism. They believed in the magic of the marketplace so strongly that it overcame their scientific capabilities in important ways. So what is market fundamentalism? Belief in, as I've already said, in the magic of the marketplace, the power and efficiency of the free market. Their belief that the free markets were the only way to protect political freedom, and that's essential. They used the importance of political freedom to justify their attacks on any kind of science, really, that threatened the freedom of businesses or individuals to do as they liked. And the argument would become that government needed to get out of the way and let markets do their magic. And here we've just put up a couple of cartoons drawn from various places about that need to get government out of the way. So much more recently, we set out to write another book in which we asked the question, where did market fundamentalism come from? How did it take such powerful hold in the United States? And we wound up writing a book that's much larger than Merchants of Doubt. It's about twice as large, on how American business has taught us to loathe government and love the free market. It's a history of a set of purposeful, coordinated programs by American business leaders to promote this ideology in academia, in public education, in popular culture, and in politics. They set out to convince us that free markets were essential to the American way of life, that anything else was a threat to that way of life. And this particular advertisement from the National Association of Manufacturers, which was a key backer of this effort, beginning really in the 1930s, as the Roosevelt administration's New Deal took hold and began to regulate business in important and powerful ways. That National Association of Manufacturers campaign restarted really after World War II. They found very little traction until the late 1960s, such that by 1971, and this is just another touchstone for in time for a long sequence of findings in that book, is a gentleman by the name of Lewis Powell, who served as an advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who shortly after writing this memo was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Nixon. Powell was furious at the weakness of business and business ideology in the face of the consumer rights movement of the early 1970s, and of particular of the environmental movement. And this is a quote from his letter here: is the current examples of the impotency of business, the near contempt at which businessmen's views are held, are the stampedes by politicians to support almost any legislation related to consumerism or to the environment. What he recommended that they do was to create a network of conservative scholars to review textbooks, to promote conservative pro-business ideas in the media, to demand equal time on television and in newspapers for free market views, etc. It would become the Powell memo that is the root of what we found in our Merchants of Doubt work, a network of, it's what nowadays we might call them influencers, but we used to call think tanks back in the 2010s. But they did this by a set of efforts involving advertising, marketing, attempts to influence radio, film, television, news coverage, a program to rewrite school and college textbooks, and influence university curricula to preserve the pro-business view, all intended to persuade the American people that any compromise to economic freedom, even something as seemingly reasonable like reducing child labor, threatens our other freedoms and therefore the American way of life. This effort by Powell and so many others resulted in the election of Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election, whose platform essentially boiled down to this one sentence: government is not a solution to our problem, government is the problem. We should trust the magic of the marketplace. And this probably sounds like I'm pinning this entirely on Republicans, but, and well, sorry, I want to go back to talk a little bit about Reagan one more time. Building on this Hillsdale College speech he gave in 1977, again, fingering the problem of the environment in the thinking of political conservatives in the 1970s. Here he is again, fingering free enterprise becoming far less free. Property rights are being reduced and even eliminated in the name of environmental protection. It's time that a voice be raised, pointing out that profit, property rights, and freedom are inseparable. You cannot have the third unless you continue to be entitled to have the first two. He's not interested in defending the right to clean water, just the right to property, to own water, regardless of its condition. And this property rights campaign is really it becomes fundamentally part of the effort to cast doubt on science, because science is what was proving, beginning really in the 1970s, that it was business activities that was expanding pollution in the United States and throughout the world. But again, I don't want to pin all the blame on Republicans, because lots of Democrats adopted this position too in the 1970s. And by the 1990s, it had become widespread enough in the Democratic Party so that we had the election of Bill Clinton in the 1992 election, and Clinton did essentially nothing to protect the environment either. It influenced the Democratic Party to step back from its earlier commitments to use the power of the federal government to protect workers, consumers, the environment, and to rely ever more on free markets. Market fundamentalism came home to both parties. So by the 1990s, America was facing a general business-led attack on science and expertise. Promulgated by this large network of free market think tanks and foundations launched by the Powell memo. This is an old slide. Naomi made it back around 2006 or 2007. It is partial now because there have been still more such institutions created to help expand the voices championing market fundamentalism, and challenging any science that threatens regulation of business. They all describe themselves as committed to individual liberty in the free market. They deny and dismiss scientific evidence of climate change. During the pandemic, they were involved in anti-vaccination and anti-mask mandate efforts. It's really was interesting to me to watch during the pandemic, how many of the climate denial organizations also turned into vaccination denial organizations seemingly overnight. In our earlier work, the Merchants of Doubt, Naomi and I called the think tank network a Potemkin village of science. And I think my colleague John Cook will talk a little bit more about why and how it works. The historian of tobacco, Robert Proctor, refers to the manufacturing of fake knowledge, incorrect science, as it were, as agnogenesis, and the knowledge itself is agnotology. The Powell's think tank infrastructure exists to do precisely this. It avoids the process of scientific publication, but replicates the appearance. That's the problem that Susan Callery was talking about. There's enormous numbers of websites that seem to show scientific information that in fact shows the opposite. Stuff that's cherry-picked, wrong, deliberately misleading, etc. That's not the product of ignorance. Rather, it's the product of a well-planned long-term strategy for creating anti-science to protect free markets. The kind of information pollution is another formulation we like to talk to people about, because this production of ignorance, again, isn't an accident, it's a product. Just as tobacco is a product, just as this laptop computer that I'm giving this talk from is a product. The sea of denial that we swim in nowadays is an ocean of information pollution, again, designed to ensure the invisible hand of the market continues to be free to operate. There's been a long-term impact. It's not primarily the subject of this webinar, that of the Potemkin village of science, that we see declining trust in scientists, and we have now for more than a decade. This chart only shows the last 7 years. Most prominently amongst Republicans, but also Democrats, again, are not immune. This is actually a really interesting transition. Historically, if you go back to the 1970s, the social science surveys actually show the party, quote unquote, least trusting of science back then was the people who called themselves independents. Republicans had the highest trust and independents the lowest. That's completely transformed in the half century since. So we see a transformation in scientific attitudes towards science, with Republicans losing the most trust overwhelmingly in the face of this campaign against science. So consequence, protecting the invisible hand of the market undermined American science. And as novelist Kim Stanley Robinson has put it, the invisible hand of the market never picks up the check for the damage it has done. And I think it's John Cook's turn.
All right. Right before we get to John Cook, and Erik, I'm sure people would love to see what you look like. We never did get a chance to see you. I just want a quote from your book, Merchants of Doubt. I found this so fascinating. And it says, there will always be those who try to challenge growing scientific consensus. Indeed, the challenge is fundamental to science. Motives, however, matter, and not everyone has good intentions. So I'm not sure where that came from, but I think that is just an incredible, incredible quote. So thank you. And we'll please start entering your questions in the chat feature. And now we're on to John Cook, and I have to say Erik Conway is coming to us from Indiana, where we're hoping the storms coming through are not impacting his ability to participate. And now we have Dr. John Cook coming to us all the way from Australia, which is the reason why we're doing this at 4 p.m. so he could get a good night's sleep. John is a cognitive scientist coming to us. Like I said, are you still in Melbourne, John?
Yes.
Beautiful city if you've never been there. And John's research is on how to use critical thinking to counter misinformation. Once again, I still call it disinformation. In 2007, he founded Skeptical Science, a website that won the 2011 Australia Museum Eureka Prize for the advancement of climate change knowledge. He also wrote and illustrated the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, followed by the development of the Cranky Uncle game, which combines critical thinking, cartoons, and gamification to build resilience against misinformation. He's worked with organizations such as Facebook, with NASA, and UNICEF to develop evidence-based responses to misinformation. We are so privileged to have Dr. John Cook with us all the way from Australia. Take it away, John.
Thanks, Susan. And it's a privilege to be invited to speak and also to follow Erik. I find that that historical perspective that he and Naomi provide is just so powerful and instructive. So I'm going to be looking at this through a whole other lens, I think a complementary lens. My discipline is psychology, so I've been spending my career running psychology experiments, understanding the impact that climate misinformation and disinformation has, and most importantly, what are interventions or ways that we can try to counter um, the negative effects of misinformation. And I'm going to start with a study that I published in 2017, a series of psychology experiments. And this really laid the groundwork, or it put me on the path towards critical thinking being a key tool to fighting misinformation. And in this study, we ran an experiment where we showed people some misinformation about climate change. Now, this misinformation was taken verbatim from a website called the Global Warming Petition Project, which was created by one of those think tanks that Erik was mentioning. Well, I don't know if they would even qualify as a think tank. There's only a couple of people running it, but the Oregon Institute for Science and Medicine. But they ran this website called the Global Warming Petition Project, which featured a list of 31,000 American science graduates who had signed a statement saying that humans weren't disrupting climate. And the whole point of this petition was basically to argue that there's no scientific consensus on climate change. So in our experiment, we showed people, some of the participants in our experiment, just this misinformation, and then we measured the impact that it had on their attitudes about climate change. And as you would expect, we found that their climate perceptions went down. This graph here shows the change in their perceived consensus. What did they think the scientific consensus was between 0 to 100%? And we found that when they were shown the Global Warming Petition Project, overall it went down by about 10%, but it didn't affect everyone exactly the same. People who were more politically conservative, the climate misinformation had a stronger effect. It reduced their perceived consensus by up to 20%, whereas people who were on the political left, it had practically no effect. So this tells us that climate misinformation is polarizing. And it's really echoing what Erik was talking about, how politically conservative beliefs such as free market fundamentalism have a strong, or not even a strong, the strongest influence on people's attitudes about climate change. Now, in our experiment, one group were shown just the misinformation, but a second group, we showed them a message before they were shown the misinformation. And this message was designed to try to inoculate them against the misinformation, build up their immunity so that when they encounter misinformation, they were less likely to be misled. And specifically, what our inoculating message did was it focused on a specific misleading technique called fake experts. Fake experts are people who convey the impression of having expertise, but they don't have the actual relevant expertise. In the case of the Global Warming Petition Project, it was 31,000 science graduates, but the list didn't specify what degree, what field of science they had their degree in. So when you looked at those 31,000 names, they had degrees in computer science or veterinary science or like medical science, engineering, but very few, less than 1% of them actually had any climate science expertise. Um, we found that when we showed people this inoculating message, and then afterwards they were shown the climate misinformation, the blue line shows the effect here. Overall, the misinformation was neutralized. It had no effect. There's a slight slope to this line, but statistically it's equivalent to a flat line. And this tells us that whether people are politically liberal or conservative, no matter where they sit on the political spectrum, nobody likes being misled. When you explain to them the techniques used to mislead, then those techniques lose their persuasiveness. Another key element, I'll just go back to our message. Another key element to our inoculating message was I didn't even mention the global warming petition project in the inoculation message. Instead, I just spoke in general terms about this technique of fake experts. And so, what this tells us also is that by explaining the techniques of misinformation, you can inoculate people across topics. The example I used in our inoculating message was actually tobacco misinformation from the mid 20th century, the kind of stuff that actually it's kind of coincidental, but this was really one of the key elements in Merchants of Doubt, how the same organizations that were casting doubt on tobacco misinformation also ended up also casting doubt on climate misinformation. So using these Mad Men style newspaper ads from the mid 20th century as examples of fake experts then was effective in helping people spot the same technique used in current climate misinformation. So this tells us that this approach, and I'll use a jargony term that we use in psychology, we call this technique-based inoculation or logic-based inoculation. This logic-based approach, or you could just call it critical thinking, really. Critical thinking is like a universal vaccine against misinformation. When you can spot the techniques used to mislead, then they no longer have power over you. So that drove me towards exploring how do you inoculate people? How do you educate people about the techniques of misinformation? And I found a useful framework for doing this was the FLIC framework. FLIC standing for the 5 techniques of science denial. And those are fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Now, I also started exploring what are practical ways to teach FLIC to people, to teach them the techniques of misinformation. And I was talking to some critical thinking philosophers, and they introduced me to this technique that they use to explain to the general public. They call it parallel argumentation, but which is sorry to be throwing all this jargon at you. What it really is you take the logical flaws in misinformation and you transplant them into a parallel situation or an analogous situation. And the more absurd or extreme this analogous situation, the clearer the original logical flaws become. And I realized that at that time that um, late night comedians use this technique all the time. They're often debunking some misinformation that some public figure has said that day. And they'll say, well, this person said this. Well, that's just like being in this situation. And then they use the same logic as the original misinformation. And it's just a very concrete and often entertaining and humorous way to explain logical fallacies. So I thought, this is worth experimenting with and testing whether this method is effective. Now, before I did my PhD in cognitive science, I was a cartoonist for a decade. And so I realized that cartoons were the perfect delivery mechanism for this approach, this parallel argumentation or logic analogies. So we ran an experiment where we showed people misinformation across a variety of topics, vaccines. This was well before the pandemic, by the way. And so well before that flood of vaccine misinformation that we encountered in 2020. So we showed them some misinformation relative to vaccines and other topics like climate change. And then we showed a debunking message. And we showed the debunking message in two different styles, a serious debunking and a humorous debunking. Like if you look closely, you can see that everything in this screen is exactly the same, apart from the image at the very bottom. So you have a more critical thinking way of explaining the fallacy, and then you have a humorous way of explaining the fallacy. And the way we structured the humorous debunking was we showed the logic of the original argument on the left, and then we took it to, we used a parallel situation where people use the same logic, but in an extreme way as a way to make the the fallacy and the misinformation clearer. Although when I was designing this experiment, my wife commented that people actually do believe this, when they're supporting their sports team, and I do it when the Brisbane Broncos play. I always make sure I'm wearing a Broncos t-shirt. Um, but then we just got knocked out this season, so obviously that logic is flawed. What we found was both approaches work. Serious debunkings work, humorous debunkings work, but the humorous debunking has several advantages over the serious approach. It held people's attention longer. We were doing eye tracking while we were running this experiment, tracking what they were looking at while they were reading the screen, and the cartoons held their attention for longer. Um, they were also more likely to share this kind of social media post or engage with it, comment on it. So the humorous approach was more likely to go viral. And just from an educational point of view, this is a very powerful way to take abstract logic and make it concrete, make it everyday relatable, and make it entertaining, which is why late night comedians use the approach all the time. And so explaining the five techniques or the techniques of misinformation is a powerful and effective strategy to building public resilience against misinformation. But these five techniques of science denial are really just categories. There's a whole range of logical fallacies and other rhetorical techniques underneath those categories, because there are many different ways to mislead the public. And so for me, as a psychologist trying to develop practical interventions, I bumped up against this real challenge. How do you teach people all these different techniques of misinformation? Not only just become aware of them, but internalize them deeply enough that when they encounter the actual misinformation out in the real world, that they're more likely to be able to spot it and less likely to be misled. And that question led me to uh, oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Um, uh, before I go to the final thing, I just wanted to quickly give you examples of these five techniques. Um, Now, fake experts, we already saw an example of it in my original experiment, the Global Warming Petition Project. And this is using people who appear to have expertise or may have expertise in one topic, but they're commenting on a different topic. And we don't tolerate that level of fake expertise in everyday life. We don't want a person with a bachelor in computer science operating on us. We want someone with a medical science degree. So if we don't tolerate fake experts in that kind of context, we shouldn't tolerate them, someone who has no expertise on climate science, then portraying himself as a climate expert. Logical fallacies cover a whole range of different fallacies. I'll just look at two of the most prominent ones. Ad hominem attacks, it turns out in other research we've published, are one of the most common forms of climate misinformation. We ran a study on Twitter misinformation, looking at millions of climate tweets. We found that 40% of climate misinformation tweets were ad hominem attacks against scientists and scientific organizations, and another 20% were conspiracy theories. So, like 60%, more than half of misinformation on Twitter is about trying to undermine public trust in climate scientists.
John, can you quickly define ad hominem
Yeah,
attacks?
sorry. Yeah, I have this real tendency to lapse into jargon. Ad hominem is Latin for to the person, and it's about personal attacks on the person rather than addressing their arguments. In fact, in the Cranky Uncle game, we changed it to personal attacks just so that it was less jargony. In fact, when I was collaborating with UNICEF, they were saying no Latin, please. We want plain language. And so like this is just a comical example of that. Someone's presenting information of an existential crisis, and the response is just attacking the person um, rather than addressing their arguments. Um, the other common fallacy we find in climate misinformation is single cause fallacy. Now, single cause is the fallacy where you assume that only one thing can affect something. There's only one factor, and you ignore other factors that might have an influence. And the one of the most common climate arguments is the argument that the reason why climate is changing now is because climate has always been changing. In other words, back throughout Earth's history, when humans weren't around, climate changed, and that was obviously due to natural causes because humans weren't around. Um, and it assumes that natural causes, therefore, must be the cause now. You're looking at just the one single cause, which is natural factors, and ignoring other factors like human activities. Now, this logic, climate is changing because climate has always been changing, is exactly the same logic as this situation. Whoops. Finding a person who's been killed, obviously been murdered, and saying, well, people have died of natural causes in the past, so this person must have died of natural causes. Obviously, ridiculous logic, but it's exactly the same logic as the past climate change argument. Cherry picking is the next fallacy I wanted to look at. Cherry picking is just looking at a small part of the body of evidence and ignoring all the rest of the evidence. And someone's cherry picking when the conclusion they come to from looking at just part of the evidence is a different conclusion to what you get when you look at the full body of evidence. And a common example of cherry picking with climate change is just looking at narrow time periods. When you look at a global warming trend, it is possible to find any short period where the trend is flat or even going downwards, even though the long-term trend is upwards. So that's why cherry picking can be so persuasive, because it's not actually saying something false. You could just be saying from this over this 3-year period, there's been no warming. And that might be true statistically speaking, but the long-term trend is obviously strong warming, and therefore it's using small pieces of evidence to paint a misleading picture. And a good logical analogy would be someone on a sinking ship, and as the ship is sinking, the bow of the ship goes up, and the person is arguing, well, I'm going upwards, so there's no problem. An extreme version of cherry picking is the anecdote fallacy. So anecdotal thinking is where you just look at like a very small um, situation. Like you just look at your own specific location, your own experience, or just what's happening to you on that day. And cold weather is a classic example of that. You're just looking at what is the weather like in this time and place right now, rather than looking at the big picture. Now, this logic, it's cold, therefore global warming doesn't exist, is exactly the same logic as arguing it's nighttime, therefore the sun doesn't exist. Obviously, that's ridiculous logic, but it's exactly the same anecdotal thinking as the cold weather argument. Lastly, I'll look at conspiracy theories. Um, Conspiracy theories are where people argue that there is a group of evil-minded conspirators who are secretly plotting and deceiving us for their own purposes. Um, here's a quite prominent example from a number of years ago now. But as I was saying, 20% of climate misinformation on Twitter/X um, are conspiracy theories. So they're a very prominent part of climate misinformation and disinformation. Um, and we published a handbook. It was actually in 2020. It was right in the middle of the pandemic when conspiracy theories about vaccines were just exploding, um, called the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. And you can see the URL at the bottom here. Um, and one thing we did in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook was we identified the main traits of conspiratorial thinking, which are red flags. So that when you see someone displaying one of these red flags, or one or more of these red flags, then that's an indication that they they might be believing in baseless conspiracy theories. And I'll just flag two of them: um, immunity to evidence and reinterpreting randomness as strong red flags of conspiratorial thinking. So reinterpreting randomness is another way of saying that they see patterns everywhere. They just take seemingly random things and say, well, these unconnected things actually must be connected. They're always drawing lines between unconnected random events as a way to try to paint this picture of a grand conspiracy theory. And the challenge with conspiracy theorists is they are immune to facts. When you present evidence that the conspiracy theory is false, they just expand their conspiracy theory to include that evidence. In other words, that you say, well, this evidence proves that that conspiracy theory can't be true. They'll say, well, that evidence was obviously created by the conspirators. And when they're in that mindset, it's very difficult to persuade them with facts and evidence because they don't trust it. Okay, I'm going to finish by just revisiting the Flick taxonomy, all these different techniques. How do we get people to learn so many techniques? I turned to gamification as a way to educate people on internalizing and learning the different techniques in the Flick taxonomy. So the Cranky Uncle game uses cartoons, uses humor. It's built on all the psychological research that I published over the years, and then it applies it in game form. And what the Cranky Uncle game does is it goes through each of the techniques in the Flick taxonomy. You can see the Flick fallacies or techniques on the right-hand side here. And it has Cranky Uncle explain them. So it uses a bit of ironic humor. Cranky Uncle is explaining, here are the techniques I use to cast doubt on the science. It uses those logic analogies. But then, importantly, it takes advantage of the game form by having them practice critical thinking. It shows them examples of misinformation, and they have to identify what is the Flick technique. And then they do that over and over again, practicing spotting misinformation. So the more they practice, the further they get into the game, the more points they collect, the more they level up and get crankier and crankier as they get through the game, the better they get at spotting misinformation. So it's just a way of using gamification and practice to build resilience against misinformation. I'll finish there. Here's a couple of links if you want to follow them up, and look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it. We have one question in the chat. Please, folks who are on, please send your questions in to our experts. And I think you've partially answered this, is what solutions do we have to combat, and this is for both of you, free market misinformation?
I'd love to hear from Erik first.
Erik?
Oh, should I turn on my audio? Darn.
And your video too, Erik.
Okay.
There he is. So, did you hear the question?
No, let me go ahead.
What solutions do we have to combat free market misinformation?
You know, people have been asking Naomi and I that for 20 years practically. And our problem is that as academics, we actually have to support free inquiry and most of free speech too. So we've liked, frankly, what John does and many others because we think it's actually really critically important to inoculate the press that used to exist, but maybe now does less so. And therefore, we have to somehow inoculate influencers and so forth through various kinds of education, like John does, in order to help cure people of belief in the products of this Potemkin village of science. I don't see any other way to do it because you can't just ban bad speech, right?
Right.
It's even if we could do it legally, I don't think we would want to because who determines what's bad and so forth. It's just all kinds of problems. So what we concluded with merchants is that we needed, we wanted scientific institutions like the National Academies of Sciences and so forth, to become kind of trusted voices of science. But of course, since then, the demise of newspapers, mainstream press outlets, and so forth, has really made that strategy that we suggested in merchants kind of inoperative. And so we need another approach.
Thank you. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that I think the answer to the question is we need to be throwing many different things at this problem. Like the problem of misinformation is just so big now and interconnected that there certainly isn't one solution to it. Um, so so I think that like I talked about logic-based inoculation, and that's certainly a key part. But even that one approach can be deployed in so many different ways. So like, I talked about using games, and like I developed the Cranky Uncle game, but there's a team in Cambridge who have developed a whole range of different misinformation games. And those are good for like reaching the public. But it's kind of a self-selecting intervention, which is problematic because like I found when we released the game, the type of people who started playing it were the type of people who followed me on social media. So they already knew all that stuff. So, so they weren't the target audience. And that caused me to then start outreaching to teachers. So
Yeah.
I published the teacher's guide to Cranky Uncle and had a whole range of classroom activities that use critical thinking, sometimes use the Cranky Uncle game. And then that led to the game being used in classrooms all around the world. Um, So that reaches a much broader audience than just that self-selected kind of critical thinking group. But even then, like that's just a part of the problem. I think that yeah, we do need interventions that can scale up and reach a lot of people. Um, and I'm still pursuing this idea of games because one of the limitations of all the misinformation games out, or most of them at the moment, are their individual games where you just play the game individually. But if we could socialize the games and get people playing against each other, competing, inviting, challenging, then it enables the games to spread and also can get people playing the game in an ongoing basis. Another weakness of these types of one-off interventions is it's the same as vaccination. You get vaccinated or you get inoculated against misinformation, but then the effect fades over time. So you can kind of become resilient against misinformation, but then it fades. So you need booster shots. Um, and so one study, which I'm really intrigued about, found that if you did booster shots with a misinformation game, after the fourth booster shot, the effect stopped fading. It stuck with people. So in other words, all the lessons from playing the game um, got cemented in people's long-term memory. So if we could just get people playing a misinformation game, whoops, I just activated my phone somehow. If we get people playing a misinformation game like 4 times, then it can kind of cement in their memory. But how do you do that? And so I think that having a social game where it's kind of like Wordle. People get into the habit of coming back and doing it. Um, that could potentially not only like just create a habit of critical thinking. So yeah, I think education, communication campaigns, um, working with government, working with NGOs, like we just need to try to tackle this through as many different ways as we can.
Thank you, both of you. John, there's a question in the chat. Could you put your last slide with your contact information back? And before we get to the next question, I just want to add, you talked about the Global Warming Petition Project, where they say more than 41,000 scientists signed. Not everybody was a scientist. So being the nerdy research person that I am, I went through a number of the names in the project, people who had supposedly signed this. And I found a pastor. I found people you could not trace. I found a tax preparer. Um, and so I found a history teacher. Um, I found a number of people who couldn't be traced. And so it's time consuming, but when you see lists of, first of all, petitions are not science. But secondly, just take a few minutes to look up a couple of the people who supposedly have signed these projects. And you're going to find that a lot of them have no background in science at all. I found a construction project manager. I found, chemists with DuPont. So anyway, it's just really important that we take a few extra minutes to do this research when you see things like this. So now let's go back to the questions from the chat. Do you have any advice for avoiding conspiratorial thinking in situations involving genuine instances of information being controlled by certain groups, like the misinformation groups mentioned in the first half of the presentation? Anybody, Erik or John, want to answer that?
Again, I'm interested in hearing from Erik because he's documented very well, like a lot of the um, ways that think tanks have misled the public.
Well, I guess the way we discovered the think tank network and how they function is that I happened to fall into a collection of materials from one of the early think tanks in the early Reagan administration, the George C. Marshall Institute. So I could see how it worked internally in their documents. And that was revealing, also kind of depressing, frankly, um, because it is so shady. It was distasteful to me. Um, but that's not the way most people are going to encounter these organizations. They're going to encounter them through their products, which, as we said, often are very convincing. They're designed to be. Um, so all I can really, again, there's a basic problem of a historical methodology, is can say is that you have to consider the sources and think about who their funding might be, which for nonprofit think tanks you can often get from IRS donation databases, or the Morningstar service, which provides the copies of their annual filings, nonprofit tax filings, so that you can evaluate who's paying their bills and that kind of thing. So if you're willing to do research, you can find out some of the backgrounds of some of these organizations, but it's time consuming and not simple.
That's true. You can always email me at susan@slowclimatecoalition.org. I will do the research for you if I haven't already. So just so you know, I'm available to do that. Anyway, there are some more questions here. Let me pull those up. How do you combat anti-science theology in our faith-based institutions?
So, in the psychology research, there's there's an interesting dynamic. Like Erik talked about how free market fundamentalism and political ideology drives um, anti-climate science misinformation. But there's a similar dynamic where another belief system, like religious beliefs, can drive anti-science, such as anti-evolution. Um, and the common thread there is when people think that their belief system, or their social identity more broadly is threatened, then they're more resistant to any scientific information that they think um, threatens their beliefs. And so, uh, like in climate, in the climate context, they've found that one way to like minimize that problem is by communicating climate science in a way that um, that doesn't threaten their belief system anymore. Um, so and I'll get to your question in a moment, but I'm just using a parallel situation. So in other words, if free market fundamentalism is what drives their climate denial, explain climate science in a way that doesn't threaten their free market fundamentalism. And so there was one experiment that found that if they explained climate change by saying climate change is real and therefore we need to regulate the polluting industries, the fossil fuel industry, Republicans are like, no, I don't like that. That's regulating free markets. But if they said climate change is real and we need to, we can solve it through nuclear power, then Republicans were like, hey, that science sounds pretty good. So in other words, when the solution didn't threaten their belief system, then they were more conducive to the science. So I think that that was a long way of getting back to your question. By explaining the science in a way that um, doesn't threaten their belief system, ideally from a messenger who shares their beliefs and values, that's the most effective way to counter that kind of anti-science attitudes. And a real world example of that is Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist and also an evangelical Christian, lives in Texas. I think is she still based in Texas? Because
I'm not sure. Good question.
she was yeah, she was in Lubbock, I think, and but now she's works for the Nature Conservancy, right? So
Right.
so I'm not sure whether she's still based there. But anyway, she's just spent many years talking to faith organizations about climate change, but through the lens of her through her values and belief systems that she shared with her audiences. And I think that yeah, she would have spoke about a lot of the objections that Christians would have, or you know problems that or
Right.
their distrust of science, and speak through in a way that affirms their values rather than threatens them.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, John, by saying that, there's a lot to do with peer pressure. So if you can have somebody who sort of shares their belief system to a certain point to, convey the message, I think it's more powerful. I look back at working on orangutan conservation back in Indonesia, and our group was based in the United States. Well, if you send a bunch of people from the US over to tell Indonesians how to do everything, they don't care. But if you empower Indonesians to talk to people on how they can help protect orangutans, it's a lot more effective. So finding peers to talk about important topics is really helpful. That's a very good point. All right. Next question is, and we can go a little bit over if people have time. So how do you think the summer events, we've seen fires in Europe and Canada and floods and all kinds of things going on, will impact their people's willingness to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Or to influence politicians to put regulations in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Erik or John, for either of you.
I can start. So again, there's psychological research into this dynamic. So when people experience or hear about extreme weather that has gotten more intense because of climate change, they can react in different ways based on their background. Now, you imagine the public divided into three groups. So you have people who are on board with with climate change, the people who are disengaged or undecided, and then you've got climate deniers. Um, and what they found was that the people who were on board, like they already their just beliefs were strengthened when they encounter extreme weather. But the people who are denying, they kind of doubled down on their denial when they encounter extreme weather. And it's the people in the middle, the undecided and the independents, who are most likely to shift their beliefs and become more accepting of climate change when they experience extreme climate intensified extreme weather. But they need to be able to join the dots between extreme weather and climate denial, um, which is why when extreme weather happens, the one of the biggest talking points from climate deniers is we shouldn't politicize this. This is not the time to talk about climate change, because the last thing they want to do, or the last thing they want to see happen, is people joining the dots between extreme weather and climate change.
Yeah.
So I think that we do need to be persistent in communicating that climate change, global warming will intensify extreme weather, and explaining how it happens. And it's complicated because different types of extreme weather are affected differently by climate change. But yeah, people need to understand that this is how climate change affects us, is through these kind of extreme events becoming more intense.
Exactly. Question for Erik. Looking at merchants of doubt, can you connect the dots between the scientists that denied the connection between tobacco and cancer and the scientists who influenced doubt and disinformation about other things like climate change?
Well, so in merchants, it was the same four guys, literally. Um, none of them, for example, were even health scientists, let alone medical doctors or biologists. They were all physicists, but they chose to involve themselves in denying the health effects of smoking. Um, None of them were climate scientists, and they chose to involve themselves in denying the reality of climate change. So in our case, it's exactly the same people. And that was another, I don't know, clue to understanding how the think tank network really worked. They've in this case, they created their own think tank and others came to them. But there are unfortunately, well placed scientists who will lend their reputations to spreading pro free market disinformation about a wide range of subjects that they have no experience in. And so again, that's the connection. These were the same people, and so they made it really easy for us to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Yeah. So we need to wrap soon, but I'm gonna bring up this final question. Are you optimistic for the future? And Erik, this may relate to one of your books, for the future and our ability to keep from being on the UN RCP 8.5, which they've already now removed.
Well, I'll say, since Susan already mentioned it, are we going to stay off the 8.5 trajectory? Yes. Um, even even if all these data centers get built, we won't change the curve that much. So we're going to be somewhere around the 3 and 4.5 curves if you like the RCP system. But the climate sensitivity of 3.3 is what they expect to the doubled CO2 scenario, still results in very dramatic warming and consequences. And I remind the college students I teach too, and it's like, we put all these things in terms of by 2100, but it actually, climate change continues long beyond that. And so the consequences do as well. I'm not I'm not optimistic about preventing very bad effects. Only I'm optimistic about preventing the absolute worst, because we are seeing the beginning of a transition. John should probably respond to.
I confess that I am less optimistic now than I probably were several years ago. But my position
Yeah.
is still the same, which is that climate change is not a binary proposition. We don't want to fall into the false dichotomy of it either climate change happens or it doesn't. Climate change is literally a matter of degrees. So therefore, every action that we do now matters. So because it will reduce the severity of down the track. We will experience climate change going into the future, but the more we do now, the less severe um, uh, we'll
Right.
experience down the track. So we just have to you know, roll our sleeves up and just keep fighting because every
Mhm.
little bit of action now can reduce the impacts down the track.
Yeah.
Well
And
said.
that's why we're here. Very, very well said. Thank you so much. And just in closing, well, first of all, I'm so honored to know Dr. John Cook and Dr. Erik Conway. They have had a huge influence on me. I'm a grandmother of two, and I'm here with Slow Climate Coalition fighting for a better future for my young grandkids. And I'm very dismayed by all of the disinformation that is out there. And I hope this has given you the ability to really do a little bit more deep thinking in the future. When you see things online, there's just massive, massive amounts of disinformation and money behind it. And as John Smigelski said up front, I'm working on offshore wind and offshore wind disinformation. And so for anybody who has questions, Dr. Cook put his contact information on a slide, and you can reach me at Susan at slowclimatecoalition.org. And if you have any further questions, we'll be sure to, if you email me, I'll be sure to relay those to our experts or answer them myself if you have any questions. But just realize we are bombarded from every angle, from traditional media to TV to online and all kinds of other areas, even in churches, bombarded with disinformation. And having the ability to be able to think critically and evaluate what you read is really important. And for people who are still on, one thing that I like to use when I'm looking at media stories, for example, there is media bias fact check. There's All Sides, called All Sides, that rate your media based on whether they're left, center, or right biased. And so I think it's important that you understand that where you're getting your information or disinformation from, how it rates that way. And then I encourage you to, even though Merchants of Doubt was written a while ago, go back and read that. It was also made into a film. Read Cranky Uncle, spend some time on skeptical science, and really, really dig deeper and help us spread the truth in any way we can, because it's so important. Any closing thoughts from anybody?
Just thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thanks everyone for attending, and yeah, continue to fight the good fight.
We're trying. We're trying. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, I want to
Thank
add
you,
my
Eric. Thank you, John.
I want to add my thank yous to the presenters and to Susan, and also to identify our marketing co-sponsors that help bring people to the webinar, and our partners in the fight to promote climate change and prep truth, justice, the American way. They all got together, don't they?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we really
Okay,
appreciate it.
everyone. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.